the illusion of grandeur and the filthy truth behind Versailles. The name alone conjures visions of gilded ceilings, cascading chandeliers, and endless corridors draped in velvet and silk. It was the beating heart of European aristocracy, the architectural embodiment of divine monarchy. To the outside world, Versailles was perfection polished, refined, and immaculate. But behind those golden doors was a world that stank of rot, sweat, and decay. What history books often leave out is this: the palace may have gleamed on the surface, but its soul was filthy. The women who graced these marbled halls, cloaked in diamonds and satin, smiling through layers of white powder and rouge, were not just symbols of elegance, they were survivors. Behind the façade of divine femininity, they endured a daily reality of filth, discomfort, and suffocating expectations. Royal women were the centerpiece of Versailles' performance. Their beauty was on display, their presence choreographed, their worth measured not by power or voice, but by grace, silence, and spectacle. They lived in a palace without plumbing, without privacy, without the luxury of basic hygiene. They itched beneath their wigs, bled in public childbirths, and masked the rancid scent of their own bodies with heavy perfumes. They were watched, constantly judged for a wrinkle, whispered about for a cough, and through it all they smiled. Because Versailles wasn't just a home, it was a stage, a place where beauty reigned and pain was hidden behind corsets and pearls, where being clean was considered risky and being too real was dangerous. Every day, noble women performed an impossible balancing act to look like angels while living in filth. This is not the fairy tale version of history. This is the truth, the part hidden behind the gilded mirrors and carefully painted portraits. And once you see it, you can't look away. So step inside and take a deeper breath if you dare. The air may be sweetened with perfume, but it's thick with centuries of secrets. 1. The fear of bathing. When water became the enemy. In the golden age of Versailles, water wasn't a source of cleanliness, it was feared like a plague. While the palace glittered with opulence, the bodies beneath those silk gowns and powdered wigs hadn't touched soap in weeks, sometimes months. Why? Because in 17th century France, bathing wasn't just discouraged, it was dangerous. At the time, medical science was steeped in superstition. Doctors believed that hot water opened the pores, allowing disease to slip inside like a thief in the night. The church added its voice, warning that bathing was not only unhealthy, but sinful, an indulgence of the flesh that tempted immoral thoughts. Together, science and religion forged a cultural terror of cleanliness, and royal women suffered the most. A full-body bath was rare, scandalous even. Instead, noble women washed by dabbing their faces and hands with cloths soaked in alcohol, vinegar, or sometimes even saliva. Water was not a tool for hygiene, it was a risk. And when the day came to actually bathe, it was a communal event. One tub, one family. Men bathed first, followed by the children. Women were last left with a lukewarm soup of filth, skin oils, and whatever residue floated in the water. If any water remained at all, this wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a stench that followed them like a second skin. Perfume wasn't a luxury, it was a weapon used daily to mask the odor of unwashed bodies. Under the elaborate gowns was skin crawling with sweat and grime. The contrast was almost cruel. From a distance, these women appeared divine goddesses in satin and lace. But up close, the reality was far from holy. To be clean was to be reckless. To bathe was to invite death. So, the most powerful women in Europe did what they had to do. They endured. They powdered over the stench, smiled through the discomfort, and wore perfume like armor. Because at Versailles, beauty was everything, even if it reeked. 2. Versailles, a palace without toilets. Versailles, a symbol of refinement, the crown jewel of European architecture. But beneath the chandeliers and golden trim lay a secret. No one wants to imagine. It had no toilets. For all its splendor, Versailles lacked one of the most basic human necessities, functioning sanitation system. There were no bathrooms tucked behind velvet curtains or hidden behind carved doors. Instead, members of the royal court relied on chamber pot ceramic bowls tucked beneath beds, hidden behind drapes, or stashed inside ornate cabinets. When they filled up, servants didn't carry them away discreetly. Often, they were dumped straight out the windows and onto the palace grounds below. No warning, no shame. Pedestrians walking outside became unintended victims of royal waste. Even more shocking, some nobles didn't bother with chamber pots at all. It was common for men to relieve themselves from balconies or along the perfectly manicured garden paths, which doubled as open-air latrines. The result was a stench so overpowering that it clung to the tapestries and walls like rot. Visitors from foreign courts wrote horrified accounts of the filth, unable to reconcile the grandeur of Versailles with the foulness beneath their feet. And it wasn't just the smell, it was the sheer neglect. There was no regular cleaning schedule. In fact, it wasn't until 1715 that a royal decree mandated that palace corridors be cleaned once a week. Once a week. Not daily, not after royal gatherings, just weekly. And this was considered progress. Toilet paper, of course, didn't exist. People used cloth rags, straw, lever, bare hands. The hygiene was so primitive that skin infections, parasites, and dysentery spread like whispers in the corridors, infecting the highest ranks of nobility without discrimination. It was the ultimate irony. The most magnificent palace in Europe was, in many ways, the filthiest. A place where beauty floated above, while sewage simmered just beneath the surface. At Versailles, appearances were everything, even if the floor was soaked in rot. 3. Wigs, the crown of disgust. At Versailles, fashion wasn't just a statement, it was a declaration of power. And nothing shouted louder than the towering wigs perched atop noblewomen's heads. These powdered masterpieces weren't just accessories, they were status symbol crowns made not of gold, but of hair, grease, and misery. Constructed from horsehair, wool, cotton, and sometimes even human hair, these wigs were sculpted into gravity-defying shapes and held together with thick pomade made from beef fat. Yes, actual animal fat. It gave the wigs their hold, their shine, and their stench. Over time, the grease turned rancid, and the smell clung to every powdered curl like rotting meat. A fashion statement, yes, but one that reeked. But worse than the smell was what lived inside. Lice, not just a few, but colonies of them, thriving in the warm, fatty depths of these wigs. Infestation wasn't unusual, it was expected. Noble women knew their scalps were crawling with tiny intruders. That's why they carried silver lice scratchers, dainty, handheld tools used to discreetly relieve the itch during banquets and soirees. Imagine sipping wine, smiling through small talk, while gently raking your head for bugs. And the suffering didn't stop there. Some wigs were so massive and heavy they caused chronic neck and spinal pain. Others, styled with flammable powders, caught fire when too close to candles. Yes, court fashion could literally go up in flames, but no matter the discomfort, noble women endured. Because at Versailles, your wig wasn't just hair, it was armor. It was social currency, a ticket to relevance, favor, and power. To go without was to risk being seen as poor, irrelevant, or worse, unfashionable. Underneath those ornate curls lay sweaty, unwashed scalps and silent agony. But in the halls of Versailles, suffering was masked with rouge, hidden under pearls, and perfumed into silence. Beauty wasn't effortless, it was a burden, and every woman wore it proudly, even as it itched, ached, and stank. 4. Royal dining, a culinary catastrophe. From the outside, royal banquets at Versailles were the height of splendor-long candlelit tables groaning under the weight of glazed meats, candied fruits, delicate pastries, and golden goblets brimming with wine. Music filled the air, laughter echoed through the halls, and every detail looked plucked from a fairy tale. But behind the velvet curtain, the fantasy spoiled fast, sometimes quite literally. The palace kitchens were a nightmare of hygiene. Versailles had no proper sewage system, and waste from the palace often seeped into nearby areas, including the kitchens themselves. In one particularly revolting incident, Queen Marie Antoinette's private kitchen was reportedly flooded with human waste. No even royalty was safe from the filth. There were no refrigerators, no concept of cross-contamination. Meat was left out for hours, sometimes days, and poultry was often served partially raw to preserve its texture. Vegetables were unwashed, fruit was swarmed with flies, and rats and cockroaches scurried freely across preparation tables. Water used for cooking was often stagnant or reused, breeding bacteria by the hour. And hand washing? Rarely practiced, if at all. The result? A silent epidemic. Food poisoning was rampant. Courtiers regularly suffered from nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and intestinal pain. Tapeworms and roundworms flourished in the royal gut. Even King Louis XIV, most powerful man in France, was reportedly plagued by a 6-inch tapeworm he passed with great discomfort. Infections like dysentery spread quietly through the gilded court, hidden behind forced smiles and tight corsets. But still, the show went on. Dining at Versailles wasn't just about eating, it was theatre. Royal women were expected to flirt, laugh, and toast with grace, even while nausea churned in their stomachs. To excuse oneself or show discomfort was a social mystipone that could spark rumors or even ruin reputations. Beneath the gleaming silver platters and flowing champagne, Versailles served not just luxury but danger. Behind every feast was the foul taste of decay. Childbirth, a public nightmare. In most lives, childbirth is a sacred, private moment, painful, yes, but deeply personal. But at Versailles, giving birth was anything but private. For royal women, it was a public performance. A spectacle, a national event. When a queen went into labor, her chamber didn't fill with silence, and support it filled with spectators. Courtiers, nobles, priests, doctors, and attendants crowded the room, not to offer comfort, but to watch. Why? Because the fear of baby switching was real. Every royal birth had to be witnessed to ensure the child was legitimate an heir born of royal blood. Privacy was a luxury queens could never afford. Take Marie Antoinette, for example. When she went into labor, the room was so tightly packed with people that the air turned suffocating. She fainted from the heat and pressure before her baby was even born. And she wasn't alone. Countless women collapsed, screamed, or bled out in front of an audience that cared more about succession than safety. The conditions were horrifying. There were no sterile tools, no gloves, and no understanding of bacteria. Doctors didn't wash their hands. Instruments were reused from one patient to the next. Antibiotics didn't exist. A single cut or tear during delivery could lead to deadly infection. And it often did. Infections, fevers, hemorrhaging, these were common, and many young mothers didn't survive. And yet, through it all, royal women were expected to be composed, elegant, gracious. Even while enduring the rawest kind of pain imaginable, their bodies became political battlegrounds. Their suffering, a symbol of duty. Their deaths, often written off as unfortunate necessities in the grand narrative of monarchy. At Versailles, a queen didn't just bring life into the world, she performed it, under the crushing gaze of an entire court. There was no comfort, no dignity, just pressure, performance, and pain. Behind every heir to the throne stood a woman who had risked her life to deliver him, while an audience looked on. The cruel contrast. When beauty masks suffering, they looked like goddesses draped in jewels, wrapped in silk, glowing under candlelight. But beneath the powder, perfume, and pearls, royal women of Versailles lived a far darker reality. Their lives were not fairy tales. They were performances staged, scrutinized, and soaked in suffering. From a distance they dazzled, but up close, the illusion shattered. Their bodies were unwashed, their scalps itched with lice. They gave birth in front of strangers. They dined with disease and lived among filth hall while being watched, judged, and expected to smile. It was the ultimate paradox. The most elegant women in Europe were also among the most neglected, beautiful from afar, horrific up close. They were prisoners in palaces, forced to uphold perfection at any cost. Pain was hidden behind rouge, discomfort buried under diamonds. No one saw the rotundly the shine. And that's the truth history often forgets. Behind every royal portrait is a woman who suffered in silence. Behind every fairy tale is a grotesque reality. At Versailles, beauty was power, but it came at a brutal price. So next time you see a painting of a queen, remember, the sparkle might be real, but so is the shadow behind it.